Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to talk about something that most sermons don't walk into. The uncomfortable, pointed question behind the teaching of submission in Christianity. Now, you'll hear many pastors say, "Wives, submit yourselves to your husbands." They'll highlight Ephesians chapter 5, verse 22. "Wives, submit yourselves unto your own husbands as unto the Lord." And then they'll clean it up, saying mutual submission. "Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church." Chapter 5, verse 25. Sounds reasonable at first glance, but here's the kicker. If submission is a biblical principle for wives, then according to the same Bible, it's also a principle for slaves. Let's flip the page. In Ephesians chapter 6, verse 5, we read, "Slaves, be obedient to them that are your masters according to the flesh, with fear and trembling, in singleness of your heart, as unto Christ." And in 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 18, "Slaves, be subject to your masters with all fear, not only to the good and gentle, but also to the froward." Now pause there, okay? Just take a pause. Let that land. Marinate. Think about that for a minute. The Bible doesn't just say wives submit. It says slaves submit. Now, many Christian teachers skip over the slave master material. They'll focus on marriage roles, gender, submission of wives, leadership of husbands, and they'll quietly dodge the part about masters and slaves. Why? Because slaves and masters don't fit. It doesn't fit our comfort zone in this day and time, in the 21st century. Because it raises big questions. So here are some points I want to highlight. If submission is a core Christian virtue, then logically it applies across the board. Wives to husbands, slaves to masters. But most sermons teach only the wives part. That's selective. So here are some points I want to highlight. Number one, why ignore the slave master passages? Nobody talks about those things. You don't hear that preached or taught. Is it because the institution of slavery still exists, subtly or overtly? If the Bible really commands slaves to obey masters, then the concept of submission isn't just about gender. It's about hierarchy and power. Why is gender safe territory while slavery is off limits? My second point, what does that imply about the teaching on wives submit? If you accept wives submit because it's biblical, but you reject slaves submit because it's uncomfortable, you're privileging one biblical command over another. That raises the question, is the authority of the Bible consistent in your teaching? Or is it being bent to fit modern sensibilities? Point number 3, consistency of morality. So if the Bible endorses submission of slaves to masters, what does that say about the kind of submission being taught today in marriage? Is it the same kind of structural power dynamic, simply rebranded as love and respect? Point number 4, the hierarchy question. Submission always exists in a power context. That's what the word implies, submission. It's a power context. A wife submits to a husband on the assumption the husband leads, protects, and loves. A slave submits to a master because of ownership and power. The Bible text treats both. That means the model being upheld isn't just voluntary mutual submission, it's structural submission. If you want the wives submit message, you've got to answer, are husbands masters in the same way the Bible uses that term? If not, how do you draw the line? And number 5, a call for honest teaching. If the church teaches wives submit, but avoids talking about slavery, it's avoiding the logical implication of its own text. It's time for honest conversation. Okay, you say wives submit. That's in the Bible. But this other part, slaves submit, also in the Bible. How do you explain it? Why is one emphasized, the other ignored? If believers take the wives submit passage literally because it's in the Bible, then consistency demands that they take the slave submit passage literally too. Otherwise, they're deciding morality based on comfort, not conviction. Biblical texts reflect, these biblical texts that we read, they reflect the patriarchal and slave-holding cultures of their time. They weren't timeless moral blueprints. I'm going to repeat that. These texts were not timeless moral blueprints. They were survival codes for hierarchical societies. So when modern Christians clean it up and say, well, it's really about mutual submission, that's revisionism. Because the Greek word doulos in those passages doesn't mean servant. Doulos means slave. The NRSV translates it correctly, without sugarcoating it. Earlier Bibles softened it to servant to hide the ugliness of what the text actually says. But truth doesn't need sugar. Truth can stand on its own. So if submission is divine law, then it applies across the board. Wives, slaves, everyone under someone's authority. Now, if that feels wrong, maybe the principle itself deserves re-examination. Because if you reject slavery as immoral, and you should, then maybe it's time to question why that same moral framework still gets used to justify female submission in marriage. You can't have it both ways, folks. You can't wiggle out of that. You cannot wiggle out of that. We're actually talking about it and facing it today because most preachers ain't going to even talk about it. They get all uncomfortable and try to wiggle out of it. We're not wiggling out of this today. You cannot have it both ways. Either you accept biblical submission completely, slavery included, or you admit that morality evolves. And maybe it's time to stop preaching ancient hierarchies as holy. So next time someone quotes, "Wives, submit to your husbands," ask them, do you also believe slaves should submit to their masters? Watch how fast the sermon changes.